right now to talk some Sixers and NBA playoffs. Joining us now on the Boardwalk kind of hotline, Bryan Toporek, Bleacher Report. He wrote a great article also in Forbes Sports the other day. He's the co-host of the NBA podcast, and as all guests, he joins us here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Bryan, how you doing on this Labor Day weekend?
I'm doing well, Josh. How are you?
Doing pretty good, and I'd be doing even better if the Sixers decide to wrap up his head coaching search sooner than later. I mean, right now it looks like they're going to, but how much do you feel like, before we get into any specific details about Ty Lue, the Nets hiring Steve Nash, Jay Wright saying my name's out of the running, how much do you think that has influenced the Sixers potentially accelerating their process?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like they've had interest in Lue from the beginning. I think the Nets were probably their biggest threat just from a win-now perspective. So the fact that they are now off the market limits Lue's options somewhat. I mean, Chicago, New Orleans both have openings as well, but Chicago is very much in a rebuild. New Orleans is young, has a lot of upside, but I don't think it's fair to expect them to contend for a title next year. So if he's looking to join a ready-made title contender, the Sixers right now, as of today, are the best option. But, given all that's happening with the Milwaukee Bucks in particular, you have to wonder if there's not going to be an opening there sometime soon.
A lot of reports claim that Ty Lue also is interested in the Sixers' job. And I have to think, and I'm not trying to do too much, spiderweb connecting here, but I do have to believe that because of Ty Lue's experience working with LeBron, working with Chris Paul, working with guys like Kawhi and Paul George, and all the players that he has personally coached either as assistant or a head coach, that there has to be traits with Simmons and Embiid that intrigue him for him to be interested in the Sixers opening.
Yeah, I think it probably cuts both ways. I think that's what should make him most attractive to the Sixers as well. I mean, it's been well documented that, when he was coaching LeBron, especially during that 2016 championship run, he was not afraid to call out LeBron and kind of hold his feet to the fire. And I think, Josh Richardson, after the sweep, said, Brett Brown's a nice guy, meant well, but the team needed more accountability this year. And he didn't name any names, but I don't think you have to jump too far to infer that he was probably referring to the two superstars on the team. Ben Simmons needs to start shooting three-pointers. He's very good at a number of other things. He improved a lot this year, but the team is not going to hit its ceiling if he just absolutely refuses to take threes. And Joel Embiid, repeatedly throughout the year said he was kind of checked out. He let the off-season changes last year frustrate him, so he's kind of just going through the motions. And he is ostensibly the best player on the team. The Sixers can't win a championship if he's not giving it 100%. So I think, the Sixers probably see Ty Lue and see, this guy called out LeBron James in Game 7 of the 2016 Finals. He's not going to have any problem calling out Ben and Joel. That's a good thing. And then from Ty Lue's perspective, Elton Brand said this in his press conference last week, Ben and Joel are 24 and 26. They are just entering their prime. They could be, even if they are at their peak right now, they are both, fixtures in the All-Star game from years to come, but both of them have MVP potential if they start to really address the weaknesses in their game. So I think there is a lot that should make this job attractive despite some of the warts.
Let's go back to what you said about what Josh Richardson said. And I know some people have been critical about him saying it, but, one of the things that stands out to me with him is that he did come from an organization that was very different than the Sixers. The Sixers organization is honestly been a mess in the front office, where the Heat have had an incredible amount of stability in the front office, in the head coaching positions for the majority of the last 2 decades. And I have to assume that Richardson, who, for lack of a better term, grew up in the NBA in one specific culture, that maybe had a bit of culture shock coming to the Sixers. And by the way, the Heat are on the verge of knocking out the Eastern Conference favorite, which was supposed to be the Sixers' job.
Right. Yeah. I think that is a very fair assumption. I would like to shout out Yaron Weitzman, who wrote the book Tanking to the Top. He covered a lot of this in detail. Just kind of how the Sixers have catered to Ben and Joel, which makes sense. I mean, they are the franchise stars, but again, you need to hold them accountable and like challenge them to address their weaknesses, get better. I mean, they have to some extent, but now the Sixers are in a spot where they've done such a bad job building around these guys, and there's no easy way out in terms of like, it's not going to be super easy to trade Al Horford or Tobias Harris. And since these guys are not the perfect fits next to Ben and Joel, the only way for the Sixers to hit their championship ceiling is for those two guys to get significantly better. So they need someone to challenge them to do this. I thought it was really interesting. Ben spoke with ESPN's Jackie McMullen, and he said, you know, he knows that's one of his weaknesses. He needs someone to challenge him to get better. Like he wants to address that, and he wants to get that internal motivation. But right now he kind of needs someone to get in his face and challenge him. And, you know, Brett did that at one point this year. You know, Ben hit the three. It was early December against the Cavs, and then Brett famously in the press conference afterwards, like, you know, tell his friends, tell his agent, tell his family, I want to see him take 1 3 a game from here on out. And he didn't. He took like 3 more threes for the rest of the season. So Ben did not respond to that challenge very well. But I think that is ultimately, if you know, I'm listing things that we need in the Sixers' next coach, being willing to challenge these guys is number one on the list.
Bryan Toporek joining us here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Follow him on Twitter at @BToporek. He's the co-host of the NBA podcast. Also a great article about the Sixers and Ty Lue right now at Forbes Sports. Bryan, let's dig a little bit deeper into Ty Lue. I know there's a perception around the sports world that, well, Ty Lue, he had LeBron, and that was really LeBron's team. And I think that perception is completely wrong, because when I read The Return of the King, and when I've read what people who have covered the Cavs have said about that team, it doesn't seem like at all that was LeBron coaching the team, quote unquote. It was Ty Lue was one of the few people that LeBron was open to challenging him, and Kyrie Irving has given Ty Lue credit for his own development. So talk a little bit more about, you know, what kind of coach Ty Lue is and what he would bring to the Sixers specifically. Sure.
Yeah. And Kevin Love, too, on a recent podcast, you know, said like Ty was a great X's and O's guy, great for our development. And I think that's, you know, the accountability thing, again, number one on the list. But I think Ty Lue is not afraid to experiment during the regular season, which is good. We're seeing that right now with the Bucks. You know, Mike Budenholzer is being really blasted right now, and deservedly so, for his rigidity and his lack of flexibility. And I think we saw last year with Nick Nurse throughout the Raptors title run, you know, Nick Nurse is not afraid to experiment. And sometimes it's going to cost you a couple regular season wins, and you're going to get mad and you're going to blame the coach. But if you're willing and able to do that, that gives you the confidence in the playoffs to say, hey, you know what? This matchup isn't great for us. We can't stick to our base scheme. I think one of the things that was kind of Brett's undoing this year was the Sixers played drop coverage on defense, which means Joel Embiid kind of hangs back near the rim, which makes sense. Great shot blocker. You want to use that to your advantage. But when guards can dribble around the screen, that's going to leave them with an open mid-range pull-up shot. And we saw that against the Celtics. Like Kemba Walker and Jason Tatum were getting whatever they wanted because the Sixers stuck to that drop scheme. I think Ty Lue will, in theory, be more willing to experiment with different defensive coverages based on opponent. So I think that should also make him pretty attractive to the Sixers.
Also, we know that Ty Lue has a lot of league connections. So is there any assumptions that could be made from the kind of coaching staff that he would bring with him? I know that he's worked with a lot of different people in a lot of different places in his career coaching so far.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we could necessarily say if Ty Lue comes, these assistants will follow, but I think you're right. The fact he has made so many connections over the years will give him an advantage when he's assembling a staff. I mean, it's just going to be really interesting to see how this all plays out because, again, as far as we know, the Milwaukee Bucks might be knocked out of the playoffs tomorrow, and it might be overreactionary and hot takey to say that Mike Budenholzer is in trouble considering, he was the coach of the year last year and they've won 60 plus games. They were the number 1 seed, but I think with Giannis's free agency coming up potentially in 2021, the Bucks are going to be, I don't think they're going to be content getting swept in the second round or knocked out in the second round. So I think they might have some big changes ahead of them as well. So, if the Sixers really do want Ty Lue, if they've decided like this is their guy, they really might need to make a move today or tomorrow before the Bucks have a chance to make any big decisions on their own.
Speaking of making moves, we know the Sixers are going to have to make some tough decisions when it comes to their roster as well. So what do you think they actually can do with their roster in relation to what Ty Lue brings to the table as a head coach if he does become the team's head coach?
Yeah, it's really tough to say until we know what's going to happen with the salary cap. By all indications, it's going to stay flat instead of increase. It's definitely not going to increase, but it could decrease substantially if the NBA and the Players Association don't reach an agreement. But it sounds like both sides realize, that would be catastrophic. So I think it will stay flat at $109 million. The problem is, contracts that are already on the books, a lot of them are going to increase in value every year. So a guy like Tobias Harris is going to take up a larger percentage of your salary cap next year than he will this year. And, you assume the cap is going to increase, which would offset some of that damage. But if it does not, that's going to be an issue. So, it's pretty well known at this point that Tobias and Al Horford have 2 of the worst contracts in the NBA. Horford's at least declines, I think it's about $500,000 each year for the next couple of years, and then the last year is only partially guaranteed. But I think it's going to be really hard to offload either one of those guys this offseason. I think the best hope basically is to trade a bad contract for a bad contract, but maybe find a piece that fits better alongside Ben or Joel. I know Buddy Hield is a popular target on Sixers Twitter. I just don't really see the incentive for the Kings to take back Al Horford. I could see, Al Horford at least conceptually might make sense on the Warriors, but they're going to keep Andrew Wiggins as their big salary matching trade chip in case a superstar does become available. So that probably isn't going to happen either. I think, Tobias Harris could make more sense for the Kings than Horford does if there's a Hield trade, but it also wouldn't surprise me if Josh Richardson's included in any of these deals. He's going into the last year of his contract. He's only making around 10 or 11 million, so it's much more affordable. I know a lot of people are clamoring for big changes this offseason. I don't know how possible or feasible they are, and I would just warn against, you have to consider, is the damage or are we doubling down on the mistake, basically? Are we going to do more damage by offloading these guys than we are just keeping them for one more year? Like, is it worth using Matisse Thybulle and trading him just to get off of Al Horford? I don't know. It depends on who's coming back, but I wouldn't just dump these guys for cap relief because cap relief is going to do nothing for the Sixers.
Bryan, let's touch on the rest of the NBA playoffs because some of the results recently have been, I think, eye-opening for a lot of people. Let's start with the one we referenced earlier, the Heat versus the Bucks. I point to the fact that I think that right now the Heat are just a more cohesive unit than the Bucks are. There are moments I'm watching the Bucks and they're just not moving offensively like we've seen in the past. And I don't want to just say that Giannis isn't mature enough or he hasn't met his peak yet because the guy is an MVP. The guy is supposed to go out there and be great, but it just seems like that one team is playing more like a cohesive unit and the other team at times is just waiting on these spurts to happen.
Yeah. I really wonder if you switch nothing else about this series other than the coaches, if you put Budenholzer on the Heat and Eric Spoelstra on the Bucks, what is the series at? And I think at worst it's 2-1 Bucks, if not 3-0 Bucks. I think this is really a masterclass of coaching on one side and the exact opposite on the other. I mean, Budenholzer, and this was the biggest concern with the Bucks going into the playoffs. I think Budenholzer has been known for a while now not to be great about making playoff adjustments. And you figure going into this playoffs, the Bucks were clearly like the best team in the NBA. They were on a 70-win pace all year, so maybe it wouldn't matter. Maybe they can just stick to what they did well all year. But when you run into a team that presents matchup problems like the Heat do, because they have, Bam Adebayo does really well against Giannis. He is one of the only guys who could actually defend him pretty well one-on-one. And then they also have a bunch of wings that they can send at Giannis at times just to throw him off balance. Jimmy Butler, Jay Crowder, Andre Iguodala. So they need a counterpunch. The Bucks need to figure out some sort of counterpunch other than drive Giannis into traffic and hope he figures something out or kicks it out to an open three-point shooter. And they just don't have that. And then throw in the fact that, Bud's minutes distribution has just been absolutely baffling throughout this series. Now reporters are just flat out asking him about it. Like, why is Giannis Antetokounmpo in a must-win game when you're down 2-0? Why is he only playing 35 minutes? And he tweaked his ankle last night, so I think it's fair to assume that he probably isn't 100%. But that doesn't explain why Chris Middleton's only playing 36 minutes, or Wesley Matthews, who's been the best guy in terms of defending Jimmy Butler, he's only playing sparingly in the fourth quarter. So, this is one of those series where I think the talent, I think Milwaukee's honestly the more talented team, but, it's close enough that this is where you're really seeing the value of coaching.
Just to dig a little deeper on that, Budenholzer is from the Popovich coaching tree. Brett Brown was from the Popovich coaching tree. And one of the criticisms I've heard of both Budenholzer and Brett Brown is their lack of X's and O's as coaches. They're great at handling the people and the personalities, but they're not great in some of the other elements of the game. Is there something to the Popovich coaching tree that the guys who leave Pop maybe didn't take as much great basketball knowledge as we may have hoped or thought they did?
Yeah, I would encourage everyone. Matt Moore of the Action Network actually had a great article yesterday about that, because it was specifically about what is going on with Bud. And this was before Game 3. This wasn't even after. But it's why is he so rigid? Why is he not willing to make these adjustments? Is it something coming from the Popovich tree? Because Pop also tended to really just want to stick to his guns and stick to what brought him there. And basically the conclusion was, if you're not willing to do these experiments during the regular season, then when you come to the playoffs, and this is the first time you're really willing to make these adjustments, it's like you almost feel like you've lost control, because if this doesn't work, then you're just totally screwed. So I think there is something to that. And, again, I mentioned the Brett with the drop coverage against the Celtics earlier. Kyle Neubeck of Philly Voice, ahead of Game 2, asked Brett in the pregame presser, the Celtics destroyed us with you playing drop coverage in Game 1. Are you giving any consideration to changing that? Brett said no, and the same thing happened in Game 2. And then we see finally in Games 3 and 4, they did start to deviate a little bit more from their defensive scheme. Joel Embiid mentioned after Game 2, we need to do something else. We need to send people out to the three-point line and hedge and trap a little bit more so we can actually make these guards think twice before they take these shots. So I think there really might be something to, the Pop tree of we're going to stick with what brought us there. But I think, Pop is, we saw it in the bubble. He actually changed a lot about what he did, in part because of injuries. LaMarcus Aldridge was out, but he was playing 3-guard lineups. He was playing DeMar DeRozan at the 4. It was actually some creative stuff from him. So I think this is part of a coach's job, ultimately, I can understand during the regular season you want to perfect what you're good at, so you have this in your bag going into the playoffs. You feel good about it. But the playoffs are all about matchups. Some teams are just going to present difficult matchups for you, and you need to figure out the best way to counteract that. I think Brett did a great job with that last year against the Brooklyn Nets. He slid Ben Simmons over to D'Angelo Russell and just completely erased him. Did that against the Raptors too. Moved Joel Embiid over against Pascal Siakam after game one and really turned that into a well-coached series. But, I think this is something when you're looking at the Sixers coaching search and possibly the Bucks coaching search, I think versatility and willingness to experiment during the regular season is something that teams need to prioritize more.
That leads me into my next question I want to ask you about is you mentioned matchups. Styles make fights, right? They say in the fight game. Well, the Rockets versus the Lakers looks like it's one of those kind of deals because, and I've been a James Harden hater for years now. And what I've seen from him in these playoffs, I'm starting to come around a little bit. I feel like he is doing way more on both ends of the court. I mean, he had more assists himself than the rest of the starting lineup combined in that Game 7 win over OKC. Mm-hmm. I feel like his style of play is finally maturing into something that I can get behind. And what he is doing on the court seems to be something that the Lakers just don't have an answer for, because at times you see them look around like who's going to guard James. Like that should never happen. And it feels like the Lakers just don't know how to take advantage of their size.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, especially after game one. I mean, LeBron said, he pointed to the turnovers. They had 17 as a team, and he said, we can't do that against a team like the Rockets because they're clearly going to run out and bomb away from deep. And then also he said, like, their speed, you watch it on film, but you don't really get a great feel for it until you actually play them. And he said, like, now we know. So I'm expecting this to – I don't think this is going to be like a Bucks Heat thing where the Rockets just reel off 3 straight, but I do think the Rockets have a legit chance to win this thing. I think, of course, the Lakers' size is going to be the big storyline here, but I don't necessarily know that they're going to take advantage of it as much as they need to. And, ultimately the question I've had with the Lakers all year is, okay, you have LeBron and AD. No one is disputing that those two are 2 of the 10 best players in the NBA, but where else is the help going to come from? Whereas the Rockets, it's like, yeah, you have Harden and Russ, but like, I know Eric Gordon's going to hit a couple threes a night. I know Robert Covington's going to play great defense and hit some threes. Jeff Green has been playing really well throughout since the season restarted. Mm-hmm. You still have Austin Rivers off the bench too. So I honestly trust the Rockets' depth more than I do the Lakers at this point. So, I mean, even if Anthony Davis, like, he needs to be the best player on the floor for the Lakers to win the series. Like, I think he had 25 and 13 last night, which looks great on paper, but it didn't result in anything close to a win.
Yeah, it's going to be wild to watch how it plays out. And of course, I know, Brian, you and Morton Jensen are going to talk about it on the NBA podcast. Of course, Bryan Toporek, quality editor for Bleacher Report, covers the NBA and the Sixers for Forbes Sports. The NBA podcast available on all platforms. Follow Brian on Twitter at @BToporek. And as all guests, he appeared today on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Brian, always appreciate the time and the conversation.
For sure. Happy to come on anytime, Josh. Have a good one.